All right, let's talk about a few other things that Darwin and Lamarck said. All right, with Darwin says survival of the fittest. What exactly does fit mean? Fit means being able to survive and reproduce. And when we're talking about reproduce, it's not just reproducing as many offspring as possible. It doesn't mean that because fish can have hundreds of eggs being reproduced and human can only usually do one at a time, that fish is more fit than we are. That's not true. We're talking about reproduce in the sense of how many individuals can survive. So even though fish can reproduce hundreds of fish eggs at a time, only a few of those can survive. That's why they need so many. The next one is natural selection occur in any situation which more individuals are born than can survive. So that's very important. We need the reason why natural selection can happen. Part of it is because there is overpopulation. So more individuals are born than those that can survive. So that's the struggle for existence. Some of those will die because there's a lack of resources. Some of those die because there's a lack of care from the parents, if the parents care for the offspring at all for that species. Some cannot survive because they're predators. Some cannot survive because they got sick. All of those are struggles for existence. That's why there's a difference in fitness. Some can survive and reproduce, some cannot. And the ones that can are more fit than the other ones. And then another really important part for natural selection is natural heritable variation. There needs to be a difference in traits within a population, which gives the individual a difference in the level of fitness. So there's variation and there's adaptation. Some are more adapted to the environment, some are more fit than the other ones. So as an example, let's say we have brown squirrels and we have black squirrels. The predator, an eagle, for example, is easier to see the black squirrels. So those black squirrels are less likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, you're going to get, or a population will have more of the brown squirrels than the black squirrels. That's just a made-up scenario, but hopefully you get the idea of how variation and adaptation comes into place for natural selection. This next one is there is a variable fitness among individuals. Survival of the fittest, those that can survive and reproduce more, those that have the heritable trait. Heritable trait means there's a trait that can be passed on to the offspring. Individuals with heritable traits that are more fit are able to be more fit and allow evolution. This next one, Darwin also proposed that living species are descended with modification from common ancestors, which we already talked about in the last video. But I'll just read through it one more time. Common ancestors is an idea called descent with modification. According to the principle of common descent, all species, living and extinct, are descendants from common ancestors. So what that means is that let's take a look at these elephants. We have all of these elephants. Some of those, the African elephant, Asian elephant, are still alive to this day. But both African elephant and Asian elephant, they didn't develop from the mammoth, but all three of these species had a common ancestor. So there's some sort of elephant that we may or may not know of that are ancestors for all three of these elephants. So all three of these elephants will have DNA that are similar to the common ancestor, this mysterious common ancestor elephant. They would all have bone structures and characteristics and traits and behavioral characteristics that are similar to the common ancestors. But you can't say African elephant is evolved from the mammoth because they all evolved from a common ancestor, not the mammoth, because the mammoth also came from the common ancestor. You also can't say I don't know how to say this, mastodon. You can't say African elephant, Asian elephant, and mammoth were evolved from the mastodon. That's not right. But all of these elephants had a common ancestor at some point that developed into all these different types of elephants. So one thing that people like to say is humans developed from monkeys. Human beings evolved from monkeys. That is not right. There's some sort of primate that's the common ancestor of the orangutans and human beings. All right, you have this common ancestor, and this common ancestor, depending on what the environment is exposed to, develop into two different species. There's the orangutans, and then there's the human beings. You can't say human beings come from the orangutans because that's not how it works. Okay, we all have some sort of common ancestor that's our ancestor, but the monkeys are not our ancestors. We do have a common ancestor with the monkeys, but the monkeys aren't our ancestors. So this is a common misconception that a lot of people have, to make sure you understand this. The next one is, what is speciation? Speciation is when you create a new species from the previous species. Now you diverge from one species into two different species. The one species that diverge into the two different species, that one species is called the common ancestor of the two species. Okay. This next one is, what is the difference between natural selection and artificial selection? Natural selection selects for the individuals that are more fit for a specific environment. Artificial selection is when people intentionally select for a certain trait. So let's say we want strawberries to be bigger and bigger. So every strawberry generation, you pick the biggest strawberry and have that strawberry tree cross with another strawberry tree that produce really big strawberries. After 20 generations, you're going to get bigger strawberries. So that's just an example that I'm giving to you. We can finish up with the evidence of evolution. How does geographic distribution of species today relate to their evolutionary history? So an example of that is marsupials. Marsupials, let's see. So marsupials are these guys, animals with pouches. So giraffes. Kangaroos are marsupials. What else? We have kangaroos, koalas are marsupials. Opossum in that runs across the street sometimes, those are marsupials. So they all have the common characteristic of having pouches. And if you look at the geographic distributions, they are all over the world. So how does that tell us about common ancestor? They all have these pouches because originally these lands were connected. So the common ancestor of all those marsupials were all over these different continents. And then when the continents moved apart, those individual species of marsupials were all over these different continents, and they further developed and modified and did this natural selection thing and become new species of marsupials. So now we have different species of marsupials at these different continents, even though they had a common ancestor originally that were all over these different continents way back in the days. So that's geographic distribution. You're looking at a geographic distribution of different species, and you can see the similarities and differences between those species, and you can come up with the conclusion that certain species that are very similar had a common ancestor. So those species can be species of species that are alive today, and those can also be species that went extinct. This next one, how do fossils help document the descent of modern species from common ancestors? So you can look at the bone structure of the African elephant, for example, and then you can look at the bone structure of a mammoth fossil, and you can compare the bone structures, and if there are a lot of similarities in bone structures, which they do, you can tell that they all developed from the same common ancestor at one point, So that's why they have these similar characteristics. But they also have different characteristics because they all adapted to their own environment. Natural selection did different things at different places because the environment is different at different locations. So that's why Asian elephants and African elephants aren't exactly the same, and they're also not exactly the same as the mammoths. This next one is called homologous structures. So let's first look at homologous structures. Okay. So homologous means similar. Homologous structure means you have similar bone structures. And the reason why this tells you about evolution is because we have all these similar, but yet a little bit different bone structures. And we have these similar bone structures because we all had a common ancestor at one point. Again, we had a common ancestor way back in the days. And we also have these differences because we adapted to our environment differently, and natural selection selected for different traits at different places. So that comes back to you have to understand this whole process in order to understand why exactly this can tell you about evolution. So if two species have more similar bone structure, humans and cat, for example, then you can tell that we're more closely related. We have more similarities in the bone structure, so we're more closely related than a human to a whale or a human to a bat. That's homologous structure. So homologous structure is similar structure, different functions. So the human's hand doesn't work exactly as the cat's paw and the whale flipper and the bat's wing, right? This next one is called analogous structure. Analogous structure does not tell you about evolution. And instead of similar structure, different function, analogous structure is when you have similar function, different structure. So if you look at a bat wing and a butterfly wing, they're both there to enable the organism to fly, but they have different structures. Because they have different structures, that means they're more distantly related. They don't have as close of a common ancestor than bat and a human, for example. So a bat and a human are more closely related than a bat and a butterfly because of the similarities or differences in bone structures, the bone structure between a bat and a human. Those are called homologous structures because they're very similar, but the bone structure of the bat and the butterfly are called analogous structure because they have a similar function but a different structure. That means they each have this these wings because those were selected by natural selection as well, but in different environment and from different common ancestors. This last one is called vestigial structure. Vestigial structure is such as an example would be your tailbone. A vestigial structure is a structure that is within your body, but it no longer has a function, but it did have a function at some point in the common ancestor. So the common ancestor of human and orangutan, for example, probably both had tails, but for the common ancestor, the tail was important and it was useful, but because we no longer need those tails, so the natural selection is no longer selecting for the bone structure of the tail, so we no longer have a tail. So now we only have a tailbone, and we call that a vestigial structure. The next one is embryology. Embryology, if you quickly look at the embryos of a fish and chicken and pig, we all look pretty similar, and because this is because of our common ancestor as well. Our common ancestor had these characteristics of the tail and the eyes and all of that. So, and embryology is an evidence for evolution because our common ancestor had those traits that all of these guys had. Molecular biology is talking about DNA and RNA and protein. DNA, if the DNA of chicken and human is more similar than that of a human and a banana, that means a human and a chicken are more closely related. And then also, if you talk about the genetic codes, the the amino acids are the same for all organisms. That also tells you about evolution because we all originated from the